Horror story from a highway bus driver. The first time Marcus Webb saw the woman in white standing on Interstate 40, he thought she was just another stranded motorist. 23 years driving the Memphis to Little Rock route had taught him to expect the unexpected. Blown tires, overheated engines, people running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. But this was different. She stood perfectly still at mile marker 197, just past the Forest City exit, her pale dress luminous in his headlights, despite the rain hammering down like bullets. Marcus eased his foot off the accelerator, the Greyhound's air brakes hissing as he prepared to stop. Then she was gone, not walking away, not ducking into the trees, just gone, like she'd been erased from existence. He told himself it was the rain playing tricks, the way water streaked across the windshield, creating phantom shapes. But his hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, and the coffee in his thermos suddenly tasted like rust. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Marcus had been driving buses since 1999, back when people still wrote letters and the world moved slower. He'd seen America from behind a windshield, the desperate and the hopeful, the running away and the coming home. His route cut through the Mississippi Delta, that flat, haunted stretch where the river had shaped everything, the land, the people, the stories they told in whispers. At 58, he knew every curve of Highway 40, every truck stop, every place where the road got swallowed by fog thick as wool. The woman appeared again 3 nights later. Same spot, same white dress, same impossible stillness. This time Marcus was ready, his dashboard camera recording everything. He slowed the bus to a crawl, his 14 passengers asleep or lost in their phones, oblivious. The woman stood on the shoulder, her dark hair plastered to her face by rain. As his headlights swept over her, she turned toward him. Her eyes were black holes, and her mouth opened in a scream he couldn't hear through the rain and glass and distance. Then nothing. Empty road. Just the rain and the darkness pressing in. Marcus pulled into the West Memphis terminal at 11:47 p.m., his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the air conditioning. He sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes after the last passenger departed, watching the video playback on his phone. The timestamp showed exactly when he'd seen her. 9:34 p.m., mile marker 197. But the camera showed only rain-slicked asphalt, the white line disappearing into darkness, the reflective markers glowing like cat eyes. Nothing else. "You look like hell, Marcus." Jenny Pritchard, the night dispatcher, leaned against his bus door. She'd worked the terminal for 15 years, knew every driver by name and habit. "You coming down with something?" "Just tired." He forced a smile, gathered his things. "Long week." "It's only Wednesday." She studied him with the sharp attention of someone who'd seen too many drivers push themselves past braking. "You're taking tomorrow off. I'll get Davis to cover your route." He wanted to argue, but the thought of that empty stretch of highway made his stomach turn. "Yeah. Okay, thanks, Jenny." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment in Marion, Arkansas, listening to trains rumble past on distant tracks. The woman's face kept materializing in his mind, that scream he couldn't hear, those eyes like pits. He'd seen death before. His wife Sarah had passed 6 years ago, cancer eating her away piece by piece. He'd held her hand through the worst of it, watched the light leave her eyes. This wasn't like that. This was something older, something wrong. At 3 a.m. he gave up on sleep and drove to the Waffle House on Missouri Street. The fluorescent lights buzzed like insects, and the smell of coffee and hash browns made his empty stomach clench. He ordered eggs and toast he wouldn't eat, just for the company of other night shift souls. "Marcus Webb, as I live and breathe." Officer Raymond Hooks slid into the booth across from him, his sheriff's deputy uniform creased and clean despite the late hour. They'd gone to high school together back when the world was smaller. "Heard you're seeing things on the highway?" Marcus's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Who told you that?" "Jenny called me, said you looked shook up, kept watching your mirrors like something was chasing you." Raymond's face was kind but serious. "You know the rules, man. Can't have drivers operating if they're having episodes." "It's not an episode." Marcus set his cup down carefully. "Have you ever heard stories about mile marker 197? Woman in white, standing in the rain." Raymond's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes. "Where'd you hear about that?" "I didn't hear anything. I saw her, twice now, same spot, same—" He stopped, seeing the waitress glance their way. He lowered his voice. "Tell me I'm not crazy." The deputy was quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into coffee he didn't drink. Finally, "My daddy told me a story once. Said back in 1987 there was an accident near that mile marker. Tour bus coming back from Graceland, full of tourists from up north. Driver fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the median, hit a semi head-on. Killed 17 people." He paused. "One of them was a young woman from Chicago. Newlywed, supposedly. They never found her body, not completely. Fire was too intense." Marcus felt ice crawl up his spine. "What was her name?" "Don't recall if Daddy ever said. But here's the thing. Over the years, other drivers have reported seeing someone at that spot. Always during rain, always at night. Highway Patrol investigated it a few times, never found anything. Eventually, they stopped paying attention. Figured it was just urban legend, you know? Drivers getting spooked, seeing what they expect to see. I didn't expect to see anything." "I know." Raymond finally met his eyes. "That's what worries me. Look, maybe take a few days off. Get some rest. This job can mess with your head, all those night hours, all that empty road." But Marcus knew rest wouldn't help. Something had noticed him, and he didn't think it would let him forget. The next evening found him at the West Memphis Public Library, 30 minutes before closing. The librarian, a brittle woman named Mrs. Kowalski, directed him to the microfilm archives with barely concealed annoyance. Marcus hadn't looked at microfilm since college, but he figured out the machine eventually, scrolling through yellowed newspaper pages from August 1987. He found it on page 3 of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, dated August 24th. "Bus crash claims 17 lives on I-40. The article detailed the horror, the late-night collision, the fire that had burned so hot it melted the asphalt, the victims ranging from age 6 to 72. Names were listed: the Hendersons from Detroit, the Yamamotos from Seattle, the Peterson family from Minneapolis. And then Rebecca Marsh, 24, of Chicago, Illinois, recently married. Survived by husband David Marsh. Marcus stared at the grainy photograph. Even through the poor reproduction, he could see her face clearly. The same face that had turned toward him on the highway, mouth open in a silent scream. The same dark hair, the same delicate features. The caption noted she'd been wearing her wedding dress, having married just days before the trip. White dress. White like headlights. White like bone. His hands trembled as he advanced the film, searching for follow-up articles. There weren't many: the usual investigations, the lawsuits, the tightening of regulations. But 3 months later, a small piece tucked in the back pages: "Husband of bus crash victim dies by suicide." David Marsh had walked into Lake Michigan on a November morning, his pockets filled with stones. The article mentioned he'd been unable to cope with his wife's death, had told friends he could hear her calling to him. Marcus turned off the machine and sat in the fluorescent quiet, his heart hammering. The library's ancient clock ticked toward closing time. Mrs. Kowalski cleared her throat meaningfully from her desk. He drove home through gathering dark, past the fast food places and pawn shops that lined Missouri Street. His phone rang as he pulled into his parking spot. Jenny, asking if he felt better, if he'd be ready for tomorrow's shift. He heard himself say yes, though he wasn't sure it was true. The route needed covering, and bills needed paying, and what else was he going to do? Hide from a ghost? But sleep was impossible. He sat at his kitchen table, drinking instant coffee and watching the clock. His shift started at 6 p.m., the Memphis to Little Rock run, the route he'd driven 3,000 times. He'd passed mile marker 197 around 9:30 p.m., right when full dark settled over the delta. Marcus reported to the terminal at 5:45 p.m., running through his pre-trip inspection with mechanical precision. Check the tires, test the brakes, verify the emergency exits. Everything normal, everything safe. He'd transported 1 million passengers without incident, had a safety record that made the company proud. The passengers began boarding at 6:15, the usual mix of travelers. An elderly couple heading to visit grandchildren in Little Rock. A young mother with 2 sleeping children. A businessman in a rumpled suit. College students with oversized headphones. A woman who might have been 30 or 60, her face lined with the kind of tiredness that came from the inside out. They trusted him with their lives, these strangers. They settled into seats and closed their eyes and never thought about the person guiding them through the darkness at 70 miles per hour. Memphis slipped away behind them as Marcus eased onto I-40, the city lights giving way to scattered towns and then to the long, empty stretches between. The sun set somewhere past Brinkley, painting the delta sky in shades of copper and ash. Flatlands stretched in all directions, cotton fields and soybean fields, and the occasional house set back from the road like a lonely outpost. This was the America most people never saw, the in-between places where nothing seemed to happen and everything somehow still did. By Forest City, true darkness had fallen. Marcus's headlights carved a tunnel through the night, illuminating the white line and the shoulder and nothing else. His passengers dozed or scrolled through phones, oblivious to his mounting dread. Mile marker 190, mile marker 192, mile marker 195. Rain began at 9:28 p.m., sudden and violent the way delta storms could be. It hammered the windshield, turned the world into a blur of water and darkness. Marcus activated the wipers, their rhythmic sweep creating brief moments of clarity. The bus hydroplaned slightly, and he eased off the accelerator, his decades of experience taking over. Mile marker 197 appeared in his headlights. She was there. Rebecca Marsh stood on the shoulder in her white wedding dress, rain streaming down her face and arms. But this time, she wasn't still. She was moving, walking toward the highway with jerky, unnatural steps. Her mouth opened in that silent scream, and her hands reached out as if trying to grab hold of something or someone. Marcus's training warred with his terror. He couldn't swerve, not with passengers aboard, not on wet pavement. He kept the bus straight, watching in horror as Rebecca stepped onto the road directly in his path. He braced for impact, for the terrible thud of collision. The bus passed through her like she was made of smoke. But something changed in that moment of intersection. The air inside the bus went ice cold. Several passengers gasped, pulled from sleep by the sudden temperature drop. The overhead lights flickered, and Marcus felt something settle over him like a wet blanket, a presence, heavy and desperate and furious. "Did you feel that?" The businessman's voice cut through the darkness. "What was that?" "Lee, probably just went through a cold pocket," Marcus managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sometimes happens near the river." But the river was 10 miles away, and they all knew it. The rest of the trip to Little Rock passed in tense silence. The cold slowly dissipated, but Marcus could feel eyes on him, the passengers' eyes, wary now, suspicious. And something else, something he couldn't see but knew was there, watching from just beyond the edge of vision. He dropped the last passenger at the Little Rock terminal at 11:42 p.m., then sat alone in the empty bus, listening to the cooling engine tick. His hands ached from gripping the wheel. When he finally forced himself to review the dashboard camera footage, he already knew what he'd find. Nothing. Just rain and highway and darkness. No woman in white. No ghost of Rebecca Marsh. But the temperature gauge told a different story. At exactly 9:29 p.m., the internal bus temperature had dropped from 72 degrees to 48 degrees in the span of 30 seconds, then climbed back up over the next 10 minutes. There was no mechanical explanation for that. None. Marcus drove the empty bus back to West Memphis, the return trip usually his favorite part of the shift. No passengers, no schedule to keep, just him and the road and the radio. But tonight the darkness felt malevolent, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. He kept the interior lights blazing, kept the radio loud, anything to push back the silence. He made it to mile marker 197 at 1:03 a.m. No rain this time, just clear, cold darkness, and no woman in white. But as his headlights swept the shoulder, they caught something else, a small memorial, the kind people put up at accident sites. Fresh flowers lay at its base, their colors vivid even in the harsh LED light. Marcus had driven this route 1,000 times and never noticed a memorial there. He pulled the bus onto the shoulder, against protocol, against common sense, against every instinct screaming at him to keep driving. He activated the hazard lights and climbed out into the November cold. The highway was empty in both directions, just him and the memorial and the enormous delta sky pressing down. Up close, he could see the memorial was old, weathered by decades of sun and rain, but the flowers were fresh, white roses, still beaded with dew. A photograph had been laminated and attached to the white cross. Rebecca Marsh, smiling in her wedding dress, alive and hopeful and unaware of what was coming. Beneath the photo, someone had written, "Beloved wife, forever waiting, forever calling." Marcus reached out to touch the flowers, and his hand passed through them like they weren't there. Like they were no more solid than Rebecca herself. He snatched his hand back, stumbling against the bus. The flowers remained perfectly still, untouched by the wind that suddenly kicked up, carrying the smell of smoke and burnt rubber and something else. Perfume, delicate and expensive, the kind a bride might wear. "What do you want?" He spoke into the darkness, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. "Rebecca, what do you want from me?" The wind died. The highway was silent except for the distant rumble of a semi, miles away and getting closer. Marcus stood there for a full minute, waiting for, what? A voice? An apparition? Some kind of answer? Nothing came. He climbed back into the bus and drove to the terminal, his mind racing. The flowers had been real enough to see but impossible to touch. Someone, or something, had placed them there recently, which meant Rebecca Marsh wasn't the only one still tethered to that spot. At home, Marcus did what he always did when he couldn't sleep. He cleaned. He scrubbed his kitchen until it gleamed, organized his closet, changed his sheets. Mindless activity to keep the questions at bay. But they came anyway, relentless as that cold rain. Why had Rebecca appeared to him? Why now, after 38 years? What did she want? Or maybe the better question was, what had he done to make her notice him? Morning brought no answers, just exhaustion and the beginning of doubt. Had he really seen her? Or was Raymond right? Too many night shifts, too many empty roads, his mind playing tricks. Marcus knew drivers who'd quit after seeing things that couldn't be real. The highway at night did strange things to perception, turned shadows into threats and ordinary sounds into omens, but the dashboard temperature readings didn't lie. Neither did the memorial, which he confirmed still existed through a quick Google Street View search. The flowers in the online image were dead and weathered, which made sense. Street View had probably been taken months ago, maybe longer. He called in sick for his next 2 shifts, ignoring Jenny's concerned voicemails. Instead, he drove to Chicago. 14 hours behind the wheel of his personal car, a journey through the heart of the Midwest, past endless cornfields and small towns that looked like they were slowly being erased from existence. He'd made the trip once before, years ago, bringing Sarah to see her family. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else. The Chicago Public Library had more resources than the West Memphis branch, and Marcus spent 8 hours there, going through records he probably shouldn't have had access to. He learned that Rebecca Marsh had been a kindergarten teacher, that she'd loved gardening and old movies, that her wedding had been small and perfect at a church on the South Side. He found her obituary, her wedding announcement, articles about the scholarship fund established in her name. and he found David Marsh's suicide note, included in a court filing from the settlement of his estate. "I can hear her calling me," David had written. "Every night I hear her voice on the wind, telling me she's waiting. She's been waiting so long, and she's so cold, and I'm the only one who can bring her home. I have to go to her. I have to bring her home." Marcus's hands shook as he read the words. The librarian gave him a concerned look, and he quickly moved on, diving deeper into public records. David Marsh had no surviving family. His estate had been settled, his possessions distributed to charity. There was no one left to remember him, no one left to care that he'd walked into Lake Michigan with his pockets full of stones, answering a call only he could hear. No one except Marcus, apparently. He drove back to Arkansas through the night, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, he tensed, half expecting to see Rebecca's face reflected in the glass. Every highway memorial made him flinch. He stopped only for gas and coffee, pushing through the exhaustion, desperate to get home. But what was home? An empty apartment in Marion, a job driving strangers through the darkness. 6 years since Sarah died, and he still hadn't figured out how to live without her, still set the table for two sometimes, still caught himself about to tell her something before remembering she wasn't there to listen. Maybe that was why Rebecca had chosen him. Maybe she recognized a kindred spirit, someone else trapped between the living and the dead, unable to move forward, unable to let go. The thought chilled him more than the ghostly encounter had. Marcus arrived in Marion at 4 a.m. and slept until noon, deep and dreamless. When he woke, his phone showed 6 missed calls from Jenny and 1 from Raymond. He called Raymond first. "Where the hell have you been?" The deputy's voice was sharp with concern. "Jenny said you disappeared for 2 days. She was about to file a missing person report." "Chicago. I needed to research something." "Research what?" "Marcus, what's going on? You're scaring people." "The woman I saw, Rebecca Marsh, I found her husband's suicide note. He said he could hear her calling him. He said she was waiting for him to bring her home." The words tumbled out in a rush. What if she's still waiting? What if that's why she's there at that mile marker? She's been waiting for someone to bring her home for 38 years. Silence on the other end. Then, "Bring her home where?" "She's dead, Marcus. She died in that crash. There's no home to bring her to. Her body was never fully recovered. Maybe that's why she can't rest. Maybe she needs—" He stopped, hearing how crazy he sounded. "Never mind. Forget I said anything." "No, wait. Listen to me." Raymond's voice softened. "I know you're still dealing with Sarah's death. I know it's been hard, but you can't let yourself get pulled into this. Ghosts aren't real. What you're seeing is grief manifesting as something else, and you need to talk to someone, a professional." Marcus hung up without responding. He knew Raymond meant well, knew his concern was genuine, but Raymond hadn't felt that bone-deep cold when the bus passed through Rebecca's ghost, hadn't seen the impossible flowers at the memorial, hadn't read David Marsh's desperate final words. Some things couldn't be explained away with grief counseling. That evening, Marcus returned to work despite Jenny's protests. He needed to drive that route again, needed to understand what Rebecca wanted. The terminal was busy with the usual Thursday night crowd, but Marcus barely noticed as he completed his pre-trip inspection. The bus was clean and mechanically sound, ready to carry its cargo of strangers through the darkness. The passengers boarded. A young couple holding hands, an old man with a cane, a teenager in headphones, a woman with worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their driver was actively seeking contact with the dead. Marcus guided the bus onto I-40, merging into the flow of evening traffic. The routine calmed him. Signal, check mirrors, maintain speed. This was what he knew, what he was good at. He'd been doing this so long it had become part of his identity. Marcus Webb, bus driver. Reliable, professional, safe. But tonight, safety was the last thing on his mind. The miles passed slowly. Memphis fell behind them, the city lights fading into scattered towns and then darkness. Marcus watched the mile markers tick by, 180, 185, 190. His heart rate increased with each one. The passengers dozed or read or stared at their phones, oblivious to his tension. At 9:15 p.m., rain began to fall. It started as a light patter, then intensified rapidly, becoming the same violent downpour that had accompanied Rebecca's previous appearances. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. In the back of the bus, someone muttered about the weather. The businessman from his previous trip, or someone who looked just like him, glanced up nervously. Mile marker 195. Mile marker 196. Marcus slowed the bus slightly, ignoring the honk from a car behind them. His dashboard camera was recording. His phone was recording. He wanted documentation this time, wanted proof that what he was experiencing was real. Mile marker 197. Rebecca stood on the shoulder in her white wedding dress, but this time she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall, thin, wearing a dark suit that hung on his frame like he'd lost weight since buying it. Even through the rain and darkness, Marcus could see his face clearly. David Marsh, the husband who drowned himself 38 years ago, answering his dead wife's call. Standing on the shoulder of Interstate 40, reaching for Rebecca's hand as she reached for his. Their fingers touched, and for a moment, just a moment, they both looked solid, real, alive. Then they turned toward the bus, both of them, and their faces twisted with rage and desperation. They stepped onto the highway together, moving directly into Marcus's path. He couldn't swerve. Passengers on board, wet pavement, protocol and training, and the weight of responsibility. He kept the bus straight, watching in horror as the two figures grew larger in his windshield. At the last second, he closed his eyes. The bus passed through them, but this time was different. This time, Marcus felt hands grab him, ice-cold, desperate hands seizing his shoulders, his arms, pulling at him with impossible strength. The steering wheel jerked in his grip. The bus swerved. Someone screamed. Marcus fought for control, his muscles straining against the invisible force trying to pull him from his seat. The bus fishtailed on the wet pavement, tires shrieking. More screams from the passengers, prayers and curses mixing with the sound of rain and grinding brakes. He couldn't let go of the wheel, couldn't let the ghosts pull him away. He had 14 living souls depending on him, 14 people who'd trusted him with their lives. "No!" he shouted into the chaos. "I won't leave them! You can't have me!" The hands released him all at once. The bus straightened, responding to his grip. Marcus guided it back into the lane, easing off the brakes, getting them back under control. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, passengers were crying, shouting, demanding to know what happened. The young mother clutched her children, her eyes wide with terror. The old man gripped his cane like a weapon. The teenager's headphones hung around his neck, his face pale with shock. "I'm sorry." Marcus's voice came out steady despite everything. "Hit a slick patch. Everyone okay?" No one was injured, but no one believed his explanation either. They could feel it. That lingering cold, that sense of wrongness that had filled the bus when Rebecca and David's ghosts tried to pull him away. They knew something impossible had just happened, even if they couldn't articulate what. Marcus drove the rest of the route at exactly the speed limit, his hands locked on the wheel, his eyes straight ahead. He didn't trust himself to look in the mirrors, afraid of what he might see reflected there. The passengers stayed quiet, huddled in their seats, waiting for the trip to be over. At the Little Rock terminal, they practically fled the bus. No one complained formally. What would they say? But Marcus knew he'd never see most of them again. They'd take different routes, different buses, anything to avoid the driver who'd nearly killed them on a rainy Thursday night. Jenny was waiting for him when he returned to West Memphis. She stood in the empty garage, arms crossed, face set in an expression Marcus had never seen before, fear mixed with determination. "You're done," she said flatly. "I'm putting you on indefinite suspension. You nearly crashed tonight. Multiple passengers called the emergency line. I had it under control. Did you? Because from what I'm hearing, you swerved across 2 lanes for no apparent reason, nearly rolled the bus, and scared 14 people half to death. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. Marcus, I care about you. We all do. But I can't let you drive anymore. Not like this. Not when you're seeing things that aren't there. They are there. The words came out before he could stop them. Rebecca Marsh and David Marsh. They died at mile marker 197, and they're still there, Jenny. They're still trapped there, and they're trying to take me with them. Jenny's face crumpled with pity, which was somehow worse than her anger. Go home. Get some rest. We'll talk about this when you're feeling better. But Marcus knew he'd never drive for the company again. They'd make him take a psychological evaluation, and he'd fail it. And that would be the end of his career. 23 years gone, because he'd seen something he couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. He drove home through the rain, his personal car feeling small and vulnerable after the solid bulk of the bus. The roads were empty at this hour, just him and the occasional semi and the endless stretch of wet pavement. He should have felt relieved. No more passengers to protect, no more responsibility weighing on his shoulders. But instead, he felt unmoored, drifting without purpose. At home, he poured himself a bourbon he didn't drink and sat at his kitchen table, staring at nothing. Sarah would have known what to do. She'd always been the practical one, the problem solver, the person who could find light in the darkest situations. But Sarah was gone, and Marcus was alone with a problem that had no solution. Or did it? David Marsh had heard Rebecca calling him, had followed that call into Lake Michigan, stones in his pockets, determined to bring her home. What if that was the answer? Not suicide. Marcus had no intention of following David's path, but actually bringing Rebecca home. Finding her remains, giving her a proper burial, letting her rest. The idea seemed impossible. The accident had been 38 years ago. Any remains would be long gone, scattered or buried or lost to time. But Marcus had nothing else, no other purpose, no other way forward. And maybe, just maybe, putting Rebecca Marsh to rest would free him from whatever connection had formed between them. The next morning, Marcus called Raymond. I need your help. I need to find Rebecca Marsh's remains. The deputy sighed heavily. Marcus, please, just hear me out. The accident site, there must be records, right? Photos, investigation reports, some kind of documentation about what they found. That's not how this works. You can't just dig up 38-year-old case files because you're having a mental health crisis. I'm not having a crisis. I'm trying to solve a problem. Marcus kept his voice level, reasonable. Look, you don't have to believe in ghosts. But you know that accident was real. You know people died there. What's the harm in letting me see the files? Maybe it'll give me closure, help me move on. Another long silence. Then, fine, I'll see what I can access. But this is it, Marcus. After this, you need to promise me you'll see a therapist. I promise. It took Raymond 3 days to compile the files, which he delivered to Marcus's apartment in a battered cardboard box. Crime scene photos, investigation reports, witness statements, insurance claims. Everything the Arkansas State Police had documented about the August 23, 1987 bus crash on Interstate 40. Marcus spread the contents across his kitchen table, organizing them chronologically. The photos were the hardest to look at. The twisted wreckage of the bus and semi, the burn patterns on the asphalt, the body bags lined up on the shoulder. 17 people had died, their lives ending in fire and impact and terror, but Rebecca's body bag wasn't among them. According to the investigation report, her remains had been too damaged by the fire to recover completely. The coroner had collected what they could, bone fragments mostly, and her wedding ring, which had been identified by David Marsh, but much of her had simply burned away, consumed by temperatures hot enough to melt metal. The remains that were recovered had been released to her husband, who'd arranged for cremation. The ashes had been scattered somewhere. The report didn't say where. Marcus flipped through page after page, looking for that detail, but found nothing. He called the funeral home listed in the documents, a place in Chicago that still existed under different ownership. The current director was sympathetic, but unhelpful. "We don't have records going back that far, and even if we did, we couldn't release them without family permission. I'm sorry." Dead end after dead end. Marcus was about to give up when he found a small notation in one of the insurance files. Personal effects returned to husband per request, including wedding dress, damaged, shoes, jewelry. Additional items stored at facility pending disposition. What additional items and what facility? More research, more phone calls, more bureaucratic dead ends. Finally, he found it. A storage company in West Memphis that had been hired to hold the bus company's property after the accident, luggage from the deceased passengers, items too damaged to return, things waiting to be claimed that never were. The company had long since gone out of business, but their records had been transferred to the county clerk's office. Marcus spent an entire day in the county building, filling out forms and waiting for overwhelmed clerks to locate files that hadn't been touched in decades. But eventually, he found the manifest. One box labeled Marsh Rebecca, Personal Effects, stored at a county facility in 1989 after the statute of limitations on claims had expired. The box had been transferred multiple times over the years. Different warehouses, different filing systems, the bureaucratic shuffle of items nobody wanted, but nobody could throw away. Marcus traced it through 3 decades of storage receipts until he found the current location, a county storage facility in Crittenden, 15 miles from his apartment. He drove there the next morning, bringing Raymond with him for official access. The facility was a sprawling complex of corrugated metal buildings, housing everything from old voting machines to confiscated property to unclaimed estates. A board attendant checked their credentials and led them through rows of shelving units stacked with boxes and crates, each labeled with case numbers and dates. "Here," the attendant stopped at a shelf near the back, pointing to a small cardboard box with faded writing. "Marsh R. 1987-2643. Marcus's hands shook as he lifted it down. The box weighed almost nothing, its contents shifting slightly. Raymond stood beside him, one hand resting on his duty belt, watching with the wary expression of someone expecting trouble. Marcus opened the box. Inside were the remnants of a life cut short. A partially melted compact mirror, a lipstick tube, a paperback novel with scorched edges, a pair of earrings that had survived the fire somehow, still bright and delicate. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, a piece of white fabric, part of her wedding dress. The fabric was stained and damaged, torn at the edges where it had been cut away from her body. But it was unmistakably part of the dress Rebecca had worn in her wedding photo, the same dress she wore now as she haunted mile marker 197. Marcus touched it gently, and the temperature in the storage facility dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Raymond swore, his breath suddenly visible in the cold air. The fluorescent lights flickered. From somewhere in the facility came the sound of boxes falling, metal shelves rattling, a scream that might have been wind through the ventilation system or might have been something else entirely. "We need to leave." Raymond grabbed Marcus's arm. "Now!" But Marcus was rooted in place, staring at the fabric in his hands. He could feel her now, Rebecca's presence, her desperation, her rage. She'd been waiting so long for someone to find her, to acknowledge that pieces of her still existed in the world. The dress was her anchor, the thing that kept her trapped between life and death. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered. "I'm so sorry." The cold intensified. Ice formed on the metal shelves, creeping across surfaces like living frost. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Marcus could hear Raymond shouting, could feel his grip on his arm, but it all seemed distant, unimportant. In the darkness, Rebecca Marsh appeared. Not translucent this time, not ghostly, but solid and real. She stood 3 feet away, her wedding dress pristine and perfect, her face calm, beautiful, young, frozen at 24 forever, while the world moved on without her. "Help me," she said, and her voice was wind chimes and breaking glass, and the desperate plea of someone who'd been screaming into the void for 38 years. "Please help me." The lights came back on. She was gone, but her words lingered in the air, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. "I need to burn this," he told Raymond, holding up the dress fragment. "I need to burn everything in this box." "Are you insane? That's county property." "You can't just—" "She's trapped because this exists. Her ashes were scattered, but this remained, and it's keeping her here." Marcus's voice was steady now, certain. "I need to finish what should have been finished 38 years ago." Raymond looked at him for a long moment, then at the box, then back at Marcus. "If I let you do this, I could lose my job." "I know. I'm sorry." Another long pause. Then Raymond pulled out his phone, turned it off deliberately and set it on a shelf. "I'm going to check the perimeter, going to be gone for exactly 10 minutes. What happens while I'm gone is not my responsibility." He walked away without looking back. Marcus worked quickly. He carried the box outside to the parking lot, found a metal trash can, and emptied the contents inside. The dress fragment, the mirror, the lipstick, the novel, all of Rebecca's earthly remains. His hands were steady as he pulled out his lighter. "This is for you," he said quietly, "so you can rest. So you can finally go home." He lit the tissue paper. The fire caught quickly, racing through the fabric and paper, consuming Rebecca's last physical connections to the world. Marcus watched the smoke rise into the Arkansas sky, dark against the morning light. The flames burned hot and clean, and as they did, the air around him grew warmer. The oppressive weight he'd been carrying since that first sighting lifted slightly. He thought he heard a sigh, relief or sorrow or gratitude, he couldn't tell, but it felt like an ending, like the last page of a story finally turned. The fire burned until there was nothing left but ash. Marcus scattered them there in the parking lot, grey powder mixing with gravel and dirt, finally released to the earth. No grave to mark, no memorial to visit, just quiet dispersal into the ground. Raymond returned exactly 10 minutes later. He looked at the empty trash can, at Marcus standing silent and still, at the faint trace of smoke lingering in the air. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done." They drove back to Marion in silence. Marcus returned to his apartment feeling hollowed out, emptied of purpose. He'd solved Rebecca's problem, but hadn't solved his own. He was still suspended from work, still drifting, still alone. That night, Marcus drove to mile marker 197. The memorial was gone. No cross, no flowers, no photograph. Just empty shoulder, the grass growing wild where it had stood. He pulled over and got out, standing in the exact spot where he'd seen Rebecca 3 times, where David had appeared beside her, where 17 lives had ended in fire and impact. The night was clear and cold, stars visible overhead in a way they never were in the city. Traffic was light. A semi rumbled past, then silence. Marcus stood there for an hour, waiting for something, though he wasn't sure what. No ghost appeared. No cold presence settled over him. The memorial stayed gone, and mile marker 197 was just a number on a post, marking distance and nothing more. Rebecca Marsh had finally gone home. Marcus got back in his car and drove to the West Memphis terminal. Jenny's car was still in the lot. She often worked late, handling paperwork and scheduling. He found her in her office, surrounded by route maps and driver logs. "I'm ready to talk to someone," he said from the doorway. "About what happened. About what I saw. I'll take the evaluation, do whatever you need me to do." Jenny looked up, her expression softening with relief. "Thank you. I'll set it up for Monday. I might not pass it. Maybe not. But at least you're trying." She stood, came around the desk. "You're one of the best drivers we've ever had, Marcus. Whatever you're going through, we want to help you get through it." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd lost Sarah, nearly lost his job, spent weeks chasing a ghost that might have only existed in his grief-stricken mind. But maybe that was okay. Maybe sometimes you had to get lost before you could find your way back. The psychological evaluation took 3 hours. Questions about his mental state, his sleep patterns, his ability to focus. The psychologist was kind but thorough, probing gently at the edges of Marcus's experience without judging. Marcus told the truth, mostly. He talked about the stress of the job, the isolation of night driving, the grief he still carried for Sarah. He didn't mention Rebecca Marsh by name, didn't describe the hauntings in detail. He just said he'd been seeing things that weren't there, stress-induced hallucinations that had interfered with his ability to drive safely. The psychologist recommended 6 weeks of leave and weekly therapy sessions. Jenny approved it immediately, along with a referral to the company's employee assistance program. Marcus was grateful and disappointed in equal measure. He'd get his job back eventually, but the waiting felt like punishment. He spent the forced vacation reorganizing his life. He cleaned out Sarah's clothes, finally the dresses and shoes and scarves he'd been unable to touch for 6 years. He donated them to a women's shelter, keeping only a few items: her favorite sweater, her reading glasses, the watch he'd given her for their 10th anniversary. Enough to remember. Not so much that he stayed trapped in the past. He started running in the mornings, something he hadn't done since high school. The physical exhaustion helped quiet his mind, made sleep come easier. He read books Sarah had loved, watched movies they'd seen together, let himself remember the good times without drowning in the loss. And he drove, not for work, just for himself. He explored back roads through the Delta, visited small towns with names like Marked Tree and Earl and Terrell. He learned the region again, not as a bus driver racing to stay on schedule, but as a person discovering a place he'd lived for decades without really seeing. 3 weeks into his leave, Marcus drove past mile marker 197 during daylight. The shoulder where the memorial had stood was empty, the grass undisturbed. He felt nothing, no cold presence, no sense of being watched, no ghostly figures standing in the rain. It was just a stretch of highway like any other, notable only because he'd chosen to make it so. He pulled over anyway, got out of his car, and stood there in the warm afternoon sun. A family drove past in a minivan, kids waving from the back window. A motorcycle rumbled by, the rider's hair streaming behind her. Life continuing, oblivious to the deaths that had occurred here, to the haunting that had gripped Marcus so completely. "I hope you're at peace," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to Rebecca, to Sarah, or to himself. "I hope you found what you were looking for." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of turned earth and distant rain. Marcus stood there another few minutes, then got back in his car and drove home. Therapy helped more than he'd expected. Dr. Patricia Chen was a grief counselor who specialized in complicated bereavement, people who'd lost loved ones to suicide, violence, sudden accidents. She listened without judgment as Marcus talked about Sarah's death, about the emptiness he'd felt since, about how driving had become both his purpose and his escape. "Do you think what you experienced with Rebecca Marsh was real?" she asked during their 4th session. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think grief makes us see things that aren't there. But I also think sometimes we need those visions, those connections to something beyond ourselves. Real or not, it helped me finally let go." Dr. Chen nodded. "Grief is a haunting all its own. We carry our dead with us, let them shape our present, sometimes let them prevent our future. What matters isn't whether the ghost was real. What matters is that you found a way to make peace with it." The sessions continued through his leave period, and Marcus found himself opening up about things he'd never told anyone. The guilt he felt about Sarah's death. Irrational guilt, Dr. Chen assured him, but guilt nonetheless. The fear that he'd wasted the last 6 years, that he'd let grief consume him instead of honoring Sarah's memory by living fully. The loneliness that had driven him to work night shifts, to avoid building new connections, to stay suspended between the living and the dead. "You did what you needed to survive," Dr. Chen said, "but now it's time to do more than survive. It's time to live again. Marcus returned to work after 6 weeks, cleared by both Dr. Chen and the company psychologist. Jenny welcomed him back with genuine warmth, assigning him daytime routes at first, Memphis to Jackson, Memphis to Tupelo, short runs where he'd be back before dark. He appreciated the consideration, even if part of him wanted to prove he could handle the night shifts again. The job felt different now. He paid more attention to his passengers, learned their stories during the brief exchanges at rest stops and terminals. There was Maria, who commuted twice a week to care for her aging mother in Tennessee. James, a college student traveling home for weekends, always buried in textbooks. Elderly Mr. Patterson, who'd been riding buses since before Marcus was born, who had stories about the Delta that predated the interstate system. These were real people with real lives, and Marcus had nearly destroyed their trust by letting his grief pull him into darkness. He'd been so focused on the dead, Sarah, Rebecca, all the lost souls haunting his memories, that he'd forgotten about the living who depended on him. 6 months passed. Marcus settled into his new routine, his new relationship with the job he'd almost lost. He still drove past mile marker 197 regularly, now during daylight hours on the Jackson route. The memorial never reappeared. The shoulder remained empty, unmarked, just another piece of highway. But one afternoon in April, Marcus noticed something new, a small bouquet of white roses laying on the shoulder at that exact spot. Fresh flowers, carefully arranged, a simple gesture of remembrance. He didn't stop. Staying on schedule was important, and the passengers needed him to keep moving, but he smiled slightly, understanding. Someone else remembered. Someone else was keeping vigil for the 17 souls who died there, making sure they weren't forgotten, even as decades passed and the world moved on. The next week, the flowers were gone, replaced by new ones. This pattern continued through spring and into summer, fresh flowers appearing every few days, tended by someone Marcus never saw. He asked around at the terminal, but no one knew who was maintaining the memorial. It was just one of those mysteries, Jenny said, one of those small kindnesses that people did without seeking recognition. Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing those flowers, taking comfort in knowing he wasn't the only one who remembered. Whoever was leaving them understood that the dead deserved acknowledgement, that tragedy shouldn't be forgotten just because it was inconvenient or uncomfortable to remember. In June, Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask Jenny if he could return to night shifts. "I know you've been protecting me," he said, "but I miss it. I miss the quiet roads, the solitude. I need to prove to myself that I can handle it." Jenny studied him carefully. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She reassigned him to the Memphis Little Rock route, the same one he'd driven for 23 years. His first night back was a Tuesday in late June, hot and humid, the Delta summer settling over everything like a wet blanket. Marcus completed his pre-trip inspection with familiar ease, welcomed passengers aboard with genuine warmth, and guided the bus onto I-40 as the sun set behind them. The route felt like coming home. Every curve and exit and mile marker was intimately familiar, carved into his muscle memory after thousands of trips. But it was different too. He was different, carrying less weight, more aware of the preciousness of each moment, each safe delivery of passengers to their destinations. Mile marker 197 approached at 9:37 p.m., exactly on schedule. The sky was clear, the moon nearly full, casting silver light over the Delta landscape. Marcus's hands were steady on the wheel. His heart rate was normal. He felt calm, centered, present. As his headlights swept the shoulder, he saw the flowers, white roses, fresh and perfect, glowing in the moonlight, and standing beside them, barely visible in the darkness, a figure, not ghostly, not translucent, but solid and real. An elderly man, white-haired and stooped, placing new flowers beside the old ones. Marcus slowed slightly, watching in his mirror as the man straightened, placed one hand on the memorial post that Marcus suddenly realized had been there all along, just hidden in the grass. The man stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, saying goodbye or hello or just maintaining connection with someone long gone. Then he walked back to a car parked on the shoulder, a sedan Marcus hadn't noticed, and drove away into the darkness. A survivor, Marcus thought. Someone who'd lost a loved one in that crash 38 years ago and never stopped remembering. Someone who understood that the dead deserve flowers, even after decades, even when no one else is watching. The rest of the trip passed without incident. Marcus delivered his passengers safely to Little Rock, drove the empty bus back to West Memphis, completed his post-trip inspection with careful attention to detail. Everything normal, everything as it should be. But that night, after his shift ended, Marcus stopped at a flower shop that was miraculously still open. He bought white roses, a simple bouquet, nothing elaborate, and drove back to mile marker 197. The elderly man's flowers were still there, arranged carefully around the memorial post. Marcus added his own beside them, white petals glowing in the moonlight. He stood there in the darkness, listening to the occasional vehicle rush past, feeling the delta wind carry the smell of rain that might come by morning. "Rest well," he said softly. "Both of you." He didn't know if Rebecca could hear him, if any part of her consciousness remained to acknowledge this gesture. But it didn't matter. The flowers weren't really for her. They were for him, a way of closing the circle, of honoring what had happened without letting it consume him. Marcus drove home through the warm June night, windows down, letting the air wash over him. When he arrived at his apartment, he didn't feel the usual emptiness. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, not the joy he'd known with Sarah, but a quiet acceptance of where he was and who he'd become. The next morning, he called his sister in Tennessee, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. They talked for an hour about nothing important. Her grandchildren, the garden she was planting, the new restaurant that had opened in her town. Normal family conversation, the kind Marcus had been avoiding because it reminded him of everything he'd lost. But now it reminded him of what remained. Family, connection, the simple gift of being alive. Dr. Chen smiled when he told her about the flowers during their next session. "That's a healthy way to process grief," she said. "Acknowledging the dead while remaining present with the living. You're finding balance." Marcus continued his night shifts through the summer and into fall. The elderly man appeared sporadically at mile marker 197, always during daylight hours when Marcus was running different routes. But the flowers remained constant, a weekly renewal that Marcus had begun to participate in. Sometimes he'd stop during his off hours, adding his own bouquet to whatever was already there. Other times he'd just drive past, noting their presence, taking comfort in the ritual. He never encountered Rebecca's ghost again. No cold presences, no apparitions in white dresses, no desperate hands pulling at him from beyond the grave. Whatever connection had formed between them had been severed when he burned her wedding dress, releasing her from the anchor that had kept her trapped. But Marcus thought about her often. About the young teacher who died too soon, whose husband had loved her so desperately he'd followed her into death. About the 17 souls who'd perished in fire and impact on a summer night in 1987. About how tragedy could echo through decades if someone wasn't willing to acknowledge it, to bear witness, to say, "This happened, these people mattered, they deserve to be remembered." In October, Marcus was driving his night route when he passed an accident. Fresh, still smoking, emergency vehicles just arriving. A sedan had crossed the median and hit a pickup truck. He pulled the bus over, activated his hazards, and ran to help before the first responders could reach the scene. The sedan driver was unconscious but breathing. Marcus helped stabilize her neck, kept her still until the paramedics arrived with proper equipment. The pickup driver had minor injuries, was already out of his vehicle, looking dazed but intact. "You might have saved her life," one of the paramedics told Marcus as they loaded the woman into the ambulance. Keeping her still like that, preventing spinal damage, that was good work. Marcus returned to his bus, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, and realized something profound. He'd been given a second chance. Not just at his job, not just at living after Sarah's death, but at making a difference, at being present when it mattered, at helping the living instead of being consumed by the dead. The passengers on his bus had watched everything, and when he climbed back into the driver's seat, they applauded. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. These people trusted him, depended on him, believed he would get them home safely through whatever darkness the night brought. He wouldn't let them down. Winter arrived, bringing cold rain and occasional ice to the delta. Marcus drove carefully through it all, his decades of experience making him confident without being reckless. He celebrated Thanksgiving with his sister's family, the first holiday he'd spent with relatives since Sarah died. Christmas found him volunteering at a homeless shelter in Memphis, serving meals and listening to stories from people who'd lost everything but kept going anyway. On New Year's Eve, Marcus worked his regular night shift, the bus full of people heading to Little Rock for celebrations or family gatherings. As midnight approached, he was exactly at mile marker 197, right on schedule. The passengers counted down together, 10, 9, 8, their voices filling the bus with warmth and anticipation. At midnight, they cheered. Someone popped a bottle of champagne they'd smuggled aboard. The college student played Auld Lang Syne from his phone. For a moment the bus was filled with joy and connection, strangers united in the simple act of witnessing a new year begin. Marcus glanced at the shoulder as they passed the memorial. The flowers were there, frosted with ice, beautiful and ephemeral. And for just an instant, so brief he might have imagined it, he thought he saw two figures standing hand in hand, watching the bus pass. Young and whole and together, finally at peace. Then they were gone, if they'd ever been there at all. Marcus smiled and kept driving, carrying his passengers safely into the new year, into whatever future waited on the other side of darkness. Behind him lay ghosts and grief and all the weight of the past. Ahead lay only the road, stretching endlessly forward, illuminated by his headlights and full of possibility. He'd been haunted by the dead for so long that he'd forgotten how to live. But Rebecca Marsh, in her desperate reaching from beyond the grave, had taught him something essential. The living have obligations to the dead, yes. To remember them, to honor them, to acknowledge their existence mattered. But the dead also have obligations to the living. To let go, to release their grip, to allow those left behind to continue forward without being consumed by what was lost. Marcus Webb drove through the Delta night, no longer running from grief or chasing ghosts. Just driving, present and purposeful, carrying strangers through darkness toward whatever waited on the other side. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the future he'd imagined when Sarah was alive and everything seemed certain. But it was enough. It was real. It was his. And somewhere in the darkness behind him, at mile marker 197, white roses bloomed despite the winter cold, tended by hands both living and dead, a reminder that love persists even after everything else has burned away. That remembrance matters, that the stories we tell about those we've lost keep them alive in ways that transcend flesh and bone and breath. Marcus checked his mirrors one last time, saw only the road disappearing behind him, and accelerated smoothly into the night. Tomorrow he'd return to this same highway, would pass that same mile marker, would continue the quiet ritual of bearing witness. But tonight he had passengers to deliver safely home. Tonight he had a purpose. Tonight he was exactly where he needed to be. The bus rolled on through the darkness, its headlights cutting through shadow and rain, carrying its cargo of sleeping souls toward morning.